Hello, it's Yiannis Karakasis. We are live on 50 Great Greek Wines, and today is episode 2 of Greek Wine Talks. I'm very happy, I'm thrilled that we have with us, as a guest tonight, Mark Andrew, Master of Wine from Noble Road, from London. Mark, besides being one of the most important wine people in the world, he's a very passionate about Greek wine. He has a very strong voice and opinion about Greek wine. So, Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Yiannis. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you with us. So we found all the buttons and we are live on Instagram, 50 Great Greek Wines, ready to kick a lovely discussion. Whenever you're ready. Are you?
Yeah, ready when you are, mate. Ready when you are.
Yeah, okay. So, I would like to start setting the background on why Greek wine is hot. What is your idea? Why Greek wine is so, at this moment?
I think the question can be answered with a slightly broader lens than just talking about Greek wine. I think at the moment, and certainly for the last, I would say, 5 years, maybe even longer. Dan and I started Noble Rot magazine in 2013, and I think already by then there was this real movement towards artisanal wines, products with authenticity and with a sense of place. And I mean, those wines have already existed for many years, obviously, and the conversation about them has always been there. But during the 90s and the noughties, and even then into the 2010s to some extent, there was still very much this idea that good wine needed to get a big score from a famous critic, and good wine needed to be marketed as a luxury product. And, the very sort of Bordelais type of school of thought. And the last decade, that narrative has shifted towards very much dare I say, it's a more sort of sommelier-led perspective on things. And with Noble Rot, and there are other examples out there, what we tried to do was to give our own voice to that conversation about wines that are really genuine and authentic, and have a real story to tell, not just in terms of the humans behind them, but very specifically because of the place that they come from. So as that shift continued to happen over the last decade, I think it wasn't immediately apparent that Greek wine was going to figure as part of that conversation. Certainly in the initial stages, I think the pendulum really swung from Bordeaux to Burgundy in terms of what the big collectors and the sommeliers at the top restaurants and wine journalists like ourselves were being increasingly interested in. Northern Rhone joined the party. Of course, there was the grower movement in Champagne, which was really a big thing as well. And as the sort of the momentum started to build on those things, a lot of people, ourselves included, started to, maybe their attention was of course always still with those amazing wines from those classic regions, those artisanal examples, those terroir driven examples, but we also started to branch out and look to places like Sicily, for example, and Mount Etna, and the wonderful things that were happening there, or Tenerife, or the Gredos Mountains, or Ribera Sacra in Spain, and the incredible resurrection of the vineyards in those regions, and these artisanal growers that were really sort of behind that kind of renaissance. People like Danny Jimenez Landi and the guys from Envinate and Jonathan Garcia at Suertes del Marquez, many other examples, of course, as well. And as that sort of narrative started to build, and lesser known regions really became part of that conversation, I think then Greece became sort of emerged on the periphery of that conversation as something that potentially there was a lot to discover and there was a lot of interest there. And I know there are guys in the States who have maybe been been exposed a little bit longer than we have in the UK to some of the conversations, particularly around Assyrtiko from Santorini. People like Levi Dalton and a lot of the top somms over there. And that conversation, of course, was spearheaded, I think, to be fair, by Santorini and by Assyrtiko, because there is such a significant quality and not just of the terroir, but of the grape variety and of the story in general. And so people started to pay attention to that. And then from there, the conversation started to build and people looked further afield. And here was this country full of incredible indigenous varieties, amazing terroirs, old vineyards, many of which are 100, 200, 300 years old in some cases.
No one knows.
No one knows. And not only that, but also this sort of kind of untapped, undiscovered element to it. You know, there are some regions that you go to where there's long history, but there's a lot of wine that's already in quite a sort of quite a good state, ready to be discovered by people who just take the time to go there. And with Greece, there is definitely some regions have those winemakers already in place to some extent, but there's also this feeling of the great unknown there, that there are these incredible terroirs that even the Greeks themselves are only just starting to pay attention to. And that opens up, if you're a journalist or a sommelier or a wine drinker or a wine buyer,
it opens a discussion, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there to discover and there's so much there to talk about. And so I think that even though Greek wine wasn't necessarily at the forefront of this conversation about artisanal wineries and terroir-driven wines and you know, authentic indigenous varieties, as that conversation continued to take place over the last decade, Greece has come into that conversation and now is really at the start of potentially a bit of a golden age, I think. Okay,
question. You talked about authenticity. I often find this word, you know, a little bit abused or overused by every place in the world. I don't know if you share this idea.
Yeah, there's a lot of words like it. The English language has
distinctive, authentic, you know, everything.
Yeah. And you know, you see it in other forms of business. You know, the word bespoke is probably the most abused word in the business lexicon now. You know, handmade. You know, hand selected. How can you hand select something if it's not an agricultural product? You know, people talk
just
about
marketing. Marketing
exactly. Words. So a lot of that stuff is empty now. I can you know, I sympathize.
But in Greek context, how can you define authenticity? So where do you find authenticity in Greek wine? And genuine.
It's a really good question, because I'd actually say there are other places around the world where authenticity is much easier to find than it is in Greece. I think, you know, Greece is kind of, at the moment, it's kind of caught in the middle between this instinct for authenticity that comes from it being a very proud country full of rightfully proud people who know that they have a wonderful agricultural legacy in their hands. But also, on the other hand, this yearning to be, because you know the Greeks are a very proud people, as you well know, and you know they want people to acknowledge and to respect and to you know be to put them where the Greeks consider that they should be in the conversation. You know, at the top end of that conversation. But in order for that to take place, I think there is paradoxically, I think the Greeks often kind of think, oh well, we have to do it the way other people do it, or we have to do what other people do in order for them to accept us. So there's this kind of juxtaposition there, a bit of a sort of a contradiction, which makes true authenticity quite difficult to find. When you find it, you know, the likes of someone like Yiannis Karakasis, or, you know, the wine I'm drinking here is Hierodymos' last wine, is 2016 Skitali, which, you know, and Hierodymos was definitely a man of authenticity. There's no doubt about it. It's one of those things where when you come across it, you know, it's something that's from the heart. It's
they
true.
They do it their way.
Yeah, it's about truth, and it's about it's kind of a warts and all sort of a thing. It's like, listen, this isn't necessarily perfect. It's not necessarily polished, but it is what it is, and it comes from this place, and it speaks of this place. And it's from the hands of somebody that cares deeply, first and foremost, about the legacy that they have in their hands, and how to try and interpret that and to present that in a way which has the most truth, has the most honesty about it. And that's difficult. It's not easy to find, because, you know, there are a lot of temptations to from the ego of the person involved themselves. You know, We're all guilty of that from time to time. But also because of the market and marketing, as you mentioned before, you know, of the necessity for us to earn a living, and for the temptations that come with us to try and earn a better living and a bigger living. And, you know, and there are times when that starts to maybe sort of cross over with authenticity. But I think if you start out from the point of authenticity being the central pillar of your narrative, if you say, well, I want to write authentically, or I want to cook authentically, or I want to make authentic wine, you know, effectively that has to be something which represents the truth of where it's coming from.
Okay, fantastic. I quite agree with this approach, and I would like to add that for me, authenticity is originality expressed in a very, very positive way, because a lot of people can do original things, but the result always, you know, is what counts. So when you have a glass of something like Charidimos or like Economo that you mentioned, or other producers, you can really, really appreciate the juice, the liquid in the glass with something completely distinctive.